I'm Alexandra, 38 female. I live in a quiet suburban town in a modest house I bought with my own hard-earned money. As a certified public accountant, my life is built on numbers, logic, and order, principles that seem to be completely foreign to the rest of my family. For years, I was the reliable one, the financial bedrock, the one who cleaned up the messes, and my kindness was consistently mistaken for a weakness to be exploited. This Christmas, they finally pushed me too far, and I decided it was time to teach them a lesson in accounting that they would never forget. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. Christmas Eve at my mother Helen's house had a certain, predictable rhythm. The air smelled of roasted pine needles and her famous honey-glazed ham. The low hum of Bing Crosby crooning about a white Christmas was a constant, comforting backdrop. For most people, this scene would be the very definition of holiday warmth. For me, it was the beautifully decorated stage for our annual family drama, a performance where everyone knew their lines, and I was perpetually cast in the role of the stoic, financially stable, and slightly boring older sister. This year, however, the script was about to be irrevocably changed, though only I would know it at first. My mother, Helen, a retired teacher with a heart far too generous for her own good, floated through the living room, her face beaming with genuine joy. She was the glue of our fractured family, the only reason my brother Nathan and I still found ourselves in the same room on major holidays. After my father passed away 10 years ago, he left behind a considerable trust. He had been a meticulous man, a successful engineer, and he wanted to ensure his family was always cared for. In his will, he named me the executor of the trust, a decision that made perfect sense on paper. I was the CPA, the responsible one. Nathan, even then, was known for his charm and his catastrophic financial decisions. The arrangement was simple. The trust would provide for our mother's comfortable retirement, and I was authorized to provide a reasonable monthly supplement to Nathan and his family to help with their expenses, especially for my niece, Lily. The term reasonable was the crux of our entire problem. Over the years, Nathan's definition of reasonable had ballooned into a grotesque parody of fiscal responsibility. He arrived with his wife, Sophie, and their 8-year-old daughter, Lily, in a cloud of expensive perfume and performative holiday cheer. Nathan, a car salesman who always dressed like he just closed $1 million deal even when he hadn't sold a car in weeks, clapped me on the shoulder. "Alex, Merry Christmas!" Holding down the fort, as always, he boomed, his voice a little too loud for the cozy room. His smile was wide and practiced, the same one he used to charm customers into buying extended warranties they didn't need. Sophie, a self-proclaimed, luxury goods influencer, glided past me with a nod that was more of an appraisal. She scanned my simple cashmere sweater and slacks with a flicker of disdain before turning her attention to the mountain of perfectly wrapped presents under the tree. Her entire existence was curated for an online audience. A life lived through a filter of affluence that was almost entirely funded by my father's legacy and my careful management. I had spent weeks picking out my gifts, as I always did. I believed a gift should be personal, something that showed you truly listened to the recipient. For my mother, I had found a first edition copy of her favorite book of poetry, a find that took months of searching. For Lily, who had shown a budding interest in art, I'd put together a professional-grade watercolor set, complete with high-quality paper, a range of brushes, and a gift certificate for a series of introductory art classes at a local studio. I wanted to nurture her creativity, to give her something that would last longer than a plastic toy. For Nathan and Sophie, it was always a challenge. Giving them cash or a generic gift card felt like pouring water into a sieve. This year, I'd settled on a reservation and prepaid dinner at a critically acclaimed new restaurant that was notoriously difficult to get into, along with a gift certificate for a trusted babysitter for the evening. It was an experience, a chance for them to reconnect, not just another object to be acquired and forgotten. As we sat down for dinner, The conversation, as always, orbited around Nathan and Sophie's perceived successes. Sophie detailed her recent collaboration with a high-end handbag designer, which I knew from the trust's credit card statement was actually just her buying the bag at full price. Nathan boasted about a potential client who was supposedly looking to buy an entire fleet of luxury cars, a story that changed slightly with each telling. I listened quietly, nursing a glass of wine, picking at my ham. I was used to this. My life, with its predictable balance sheets and quiet evenings, was uninteresting to them. They never asked about my work, my friends, or my recent vacation to the national parks, which I had paid for with my own money. My role was to be the stable, silent benefactor, the audience for their carefully constructed fiction. The lie wasn't just in their inflated stories, it was in the very foundation of our gathering. It was the lie that we were a happy, normal family sharing a special moment. In reality, we were a collection of resentments and obligations, all of us tied to a bank account that I controlled, a fact that simmered just beneath the surface of every forced smile and hollow pleasantry. This year, that simmering resentment was about to boil over, and the carefully wrapped lie we all pretended to believe in was about to be torn to shreds. I just smiled, refilled my mother's water glass, and waited for the evening to unfold, unaware that the catalyst would be an 8-year-old girl and a thoughtfully chosen gift. The post-dinner ritual was always the same, a slow migration from the dining room to the living room, where the Christmas tree stood blinking, its branches sagging under the weight of ornaments and expectations. My mother would settle into her favorite armchair, a cup of decaf tea in her hands, her eyes sparkling with anticipation. This was her favorite part of the night, the culmination of all the baking, decorating, and planning. It was the moment she could watch her family, whole and together, sharing in the joy of giving. The tragic irony, which became clearer to me each year, was that the joy was rarely genuine. For Nathan and Sophie, it was a competitive sport, a showcase of material wealth. Their gifts were always flashy, expensive, and conspicuously branded. They started the proceedings, handing my mother a large, ornately wrapped box. It contained a designer scarf, the kind that costs more than a month's worth of groceries, in a pattern I knew she would find too garish to ever wear. But she gushed over it, as she was expected to. "Oh, Sophie, Nathan, it's just beautiful. You shouldn't have," she said, her voice laced with the practiced gratitude of a mother determined to keep the peace. For me, they produced a gift set from a popular but generic bath and body store. It was the kind of impersonal gift you buy for a distant colleague, a clear afterthought. "We know how stressed you get with work, Alex," Sophie said with a saccharine smile. "A little self-care." I thanked them, placing the brightly colored box beside me without opening it. Then it was my turn. I gave my mother her first edition book. As she unwrapped it, her polite smile dissolved into a look of pure, unadulterated delight. She ran her fingers over the worn cover, her eyes welling up. "Alexandra," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "How did you ever find this?" For a fleeting moment, the room was filled with a genuine warmth. Nathan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, and Sophie busied herself by scrolling through her phone. My gift, which cost a fraction of their scarf, had elicited a response they could never buy. The tension in the room ratcheted up a notch. Finally, I turned to Lily. I handed her the large, carefully wrapped box containing the art set and the certificate for the classes. "I've seen your drawings, sweetie," I said softly. "You're so talented. I thought this might be fun for you." Lily tore into the paper with the unbridled enthusiasm of a child. She pulled out the wooden case, opening it to reveal the neat rows of watercolor pans, the array of brushes, the thick, textured paper. Her eyes widened. For a moment, I saw the same genuine spark I had seen in my mother. She looked up, her mouth open to say something, but before she could speak, she glanced at her father. Nathan caught her eye and gave a subtle, almost imperceptible shake of his head. His expression was a complex mixture of jealousy and disdain. Lily's face fell. The light in her eyes flickered and died. She looked down at the art set in her lap, her little shoulders slumping. She then looked back at me, her expression now a parroted version of her parents' condescension. In a clear, piping voice that cut through the cozy atmosphere of the room, she announced, "My dad says you only buy cheap junk because you don't have a lot of money like we do." Silence. A thick, suffocating silence descended upon the room, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Every eye turned to me. My mother looked horrified, her hand flying to her mouth. I saw Nathan quickly flash a smug, triumphant smirk at Sophie, who was trying and failing to suppress a giggle behind her hand. Some of the extended family, uncles and cousins who had witnessed years of this dynamic, chuckled aqua. Ardly, not knowing where to look, they laughed. They actually laughed. It wasn't a mean-spirited laugh, perhaps, but it was a laugh of complicity, of people who knew the score and were content to watch the game play out. In that moment, something inside me didn't break. It solidified. It hardened into a cold, clear, and unshakable resolve. For years, I had absorbed their slights, their backhanded compliments, their thinly veiled contempt for my sensible life. I had justified my financial support as my duty, my promise to my father to look after his family. I had told myself their behavior was a product of their own insecurities. But hearing their poison drip from the mouth of an innocent child, seeing the smug satisfaction on my brother's face as he used his own daughter to wound me, that was a line they could not uncross. They weren't just ungrateful, they were cruel. And I had been funding their cruelty. I looked at Lily, whose face was no-crumpled in confusion, sensing she had said something truly wrong. I gave her a small, tight smile, then I looked at Nathan, meeting his gaze directly. He had the decency to look away, a faint flush creeping up his neck. I didn't say a word. I didn't yell or cry or make a scene. That's what they expected, what they wanted. It would have fed their narrative that I was the overly emotional, dramatic one. Instead, I just smiled. It was a calm, serene smile that didn't reach my eyes. I stood up gracefully. "Well, it's getting late," I said, my voice even and steady. "Thank you for dinner, Mom. It was wonderful." I hugged her tightly, whispering, "Don't worry about it. We'll talk later." I gathered my purse and the unwanted bath set, wished everyone a flat, Merry Christmas, and walked out the door into the cold night air, leaving the sound of their nervous laughter behind me. They thought they had won. They thought they had finally put me in my place. They had no idea they had just lost everything. The drive home was quiet. The usual Christmas songs on the radio felt mocking, their cheerful melodies a stark contrast to the icy fury solidifying in my gut. I didn't feel sad or hurt anymore. The years of accumulated slights and casual cruelties had finally coalesced into a single, sharp point of clarity. It wasn't about a cheap gift. It was about a fundamental lack of respect, a deep-seated entitlement that I had not just enabled, but actively financed. My father had wanted his family to be cared for, not turned into parasitic caricatures of wealth who used his hard-earned money as a weapon against his own daughter. When I got home, I didn't bother to put away the bath set they had given me. I dropped it directly into the trash can by my garage. It felt symbolic. Inside, the silence of my house was a comfort. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea, the familiar ritual a small anchor in the storm of my thoughts. I sat at my dining room table, which doubled as my home office, and opened my laptop. As the executor of my father's trust, I had complete and total oversight of all its accounts. This included the main investment portfolio that generated the income, my mother's personal account into which her living expenses were transferred, and a separate checking account with an associated credit card that I had set up for Nathan and Sophie. The idea, initially, was to make things easier. It was for emergencies and Lily's expenses, things like school supplies, doctor's visits, or after-school activities. I would transfer their reasonable supplement into this account each month, and they could use the card for those approved costs. It was a system built on trust, a trust I now realized had been a fool's investment. With a few clicks, I was logged into the trust's primary banking portal. I navigated to the account management page for Nathan and Sophie's supplementary account. The screen glowed in the darkroom, illuminating my face. Their current balance was a paltry $112. Their monthly stipend had been deposited a week ago. I knew for a fact it had been $5,000. My eyes narrowed as I clicked on the credit card tab associated with the account. The balance was staggering. They had maxed it out, a $25,000 limit, and the summary of recent purchases read like a catalog for the nouveau rich. Designer clothing boutiques, extravagant dinners, a spa day for Sophie and her friends, and a charge from a high-end electronics store that was likely for the giant new television Nathan had been bragging about. These were not for Lily. These were not emergencies. This was a lifestyle funded by a lie. My finger hovered over the button on the screen. It was a simple digital switch. Freeze card. It was a tool I had used before, but only for legitimate security concerns like a suspected fraudulent charge. Using it now felt different. It felt like taking back control. It felt like justice. I thought of my father, a man who had worked 60-hour weeks, who had saved and invested diligently, who respected the value of a dollar. I thought of the condescending smirk on my brother's face. I thought of my niece's parroted words, cheap junk. I clicked the button. A small confirmation box popped up. Are you sure you want to suspend all transactions for this card? I clicked confirm without a moment's hesitation. The status flipped from active to frozen in an instant. It was done. I went to bed and for the first time in a long time slept soundly. I didn't have to wait long for the fallout. My phone rang at precisely 2:17 p.m. the next day, Christmas Day. I was at home, enjoying a quiet afternoon with a book and leftovers, deliberately ignoring the flood of family text messages. The caller ID flashed Sophie. I let it ring for a moment, savoring the anticipation, then answered with a calm, neutral hello. The sound that erupted from my phone was not a greeting. It was a shriek, a high-pitched, incoherent squawk of pure rage. Alexandra, what did you do? She screamed, her voice distorted by fury. In the background, I could hear the beeping of a cash register and the low murmur of other shoppers. I'm at the checkout. I'm buying Lily's real Christmas present since yours were so pathetic, and the card was declined. Declined? In front of everyone. Do you know how embarrassing this is? I held the phone away from my ear, waiting for her to pause for breath. Her sense of entitlement was so profound that it never even occurred to her that she was the one in the wrong. In her mind, that money was hers by divine right. Oh, really? I said, my voice dripping with false concern. Declined? That's strange. The account should be fine. I was deliberately playing dumb, letting her dig her own grave. It's not fine, she screeched. The cashier tried it 3 times. It's your fault. You need to fix this right now. I have a cart full of things here and people are staring. I could picture the scene perfectly. Sophie, dressed in some ridiculously expensive outfit, tapping her perfectly manicured nails on the counter, her face a mask of indignation, trying to buy more things she didn't need with money she hadn't earned. Sophie, I said, my voice suddenly shifting from sweet to steel, there will be no more purchases. The card has been frozen. Permanently. The line went silent for a beat. I could almost hear the gears in her head grinding, trying to process what I had just said. What do you mean, frozen? She stammered, the rage momentarily replaced by confusion. You can't do that. Oh, I can, I replied coolly. As the executor of the trust, I can and I have. You see, the funds you've been so freely spending are meant for necessary expenses and the care of your daughter, not for funding your fantasy lifestyle. Your comment last night, and more importantly, the attitude behind it, made me realize that the current arrangement is no longer sustainable. So, consider this a reevaluation of what constitutes a reasonable supplement. Have a very Merry Christmas, Sophie. I hope you find a way to pay for your things. And with that, I hung up. I blocked her number, and then Nathan's for good measure. The silence that followed was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. The price of their entitlement, they were about to discover, was much higher than they could ever have imagined. The day after Christmas, often a quiet day of recovery and leftovers, became my day of reckoning. The confrontation with Sophie had been the opening salvo, but I knew a much larger battle loomed. Nathan and Sophie weren't just careless spenders. The scale of their debt on the trust's credit card suggested something more systemic. A single phone call wasn't going to solve the problem. I needed facts, figures, and irrefutable proof. I needed to build a case, not just for my own peace of mind, but to present to my mother, who I knew would be caught in the emotional crossfire. Her instinct would be to smooth things over, to find a compromise. I had to show her that compromise was no longer an option. I dedicated the entire day to a deep forensic audit of the supplementary account I managed for them. I pulled digital bank statements and credit card records going back 5 years. I created a master spreadsheet, my fingers flying across the keyboard with a grim sense of purpose. This was my world. In the land of numbers, there is no room for excuses or emotional manipulation. A debit is a debit. A lie is a lie. And the story these numbers told was one of audacious, breathtaking deception. The reasonable supplement I deposited each month was supposed to be just that, a supplement. Nathan had a job. Sophie claimed her influencer status was a source of income. Their share from the trust was meant to be a safety net to help with the mortgage on their modest suburban home and Lily's needs. The first thing I did was cross-reference the major expenses with their known life events. They claimed they needed help with a new roof 2 years ago. I had approved a one-time withdrawal of $15,000 from the trust for that purpose. But as I scanned the credit card statements from that same period, I found charges for a 2-week, all-inclusive vacation to a 5-star resort in the Caribbean. The dates matched perfectly. They had taken the roofing money and gone on a luxury holiday, presumably letting their actual roof continue to leak. The deception was woven into the very fabric of their spending. There were hundreds of charges at high-end restaurants categorized under client entertainment for Nathan's job. But Nathan's job provided him with a company card for legitimate business expenses. These were fancy dinners with their friends, all charged to our father's legacy. There were monthly charges for educational supplies for Lily, which turned out to be subscription boxes for designer clothes and expensive gadgets. Sophie's business expenses were the most galling. Thousands of dollars were spent at Gucci, Louis Vuitton, and Chanel, all logged as wardrobe for content creation. She wasn't getting these items for free through collaborations. She was buying them with family money and passing it off as a business investment. I felt a cold, hard knot tighten in my stomach. It wasn't just about the money. It was the calculated, long-term fraud. They had been systematically lying to me for years. Every time they had come to me with a sob story about a broken water heater or an unexpected medical bill, it had been a lie, a performance designed to extract more money. While they were secretly funding a life of luxury, they had leveraged my love for my family, my sense of duty, and my trust against me. The final straw came when I investigated their housing situation. They lived in a house that seemed modest enough, but property taxes in their town were high. The mortgage payments, which the trust was helping with, were substantial. On a whim, I did a public records search on their property. The results made my blood run cold. A year ago, they had taken out a massive second mortgage on the house, a home equity line of credit. They had pulled out nearly $100,000 in equity. I cross-referenced this with the trust account records. In the months following the new loan, their spending on the trust's credit card had actually decreased slightly, while their personal spending, which I could infer from their social media posts, had exploded. They had acquired a new luxury SUV, gone on another vacation, and Sophie had started showing off new, expensive jewelry. The picture became devastatingly clear. They were using the trust money to make the minimum payments on a mountain of personal debt they had hidden from me. They had leveraged the family home, a place my parents had helped them buy, and were using the trust as a slush fund to keep their creditors at bay while continuing their unsustainable spending habits. They weren't just skating on thin ice, they were standing in the middle of a melting lake, and I was the only thing keeping them from plunging into the icy depths of bankruptcy. My father's trust, his legacy of security and care, was being used as collateral for their financial self-destruction. By the end of the day, my spreadsheet was a damning indictment of their character. I had categorized every suspicious expense, highlighted every lie, and calculated the total amount they had misappropriated over the 5-year period. The number was obscene, well into the 6 figures. It was far beyond a simple case of overspending. It was a deliberate, malicious, and sustained campaign of deceit. I saved the file, naming it the reckoning. The investigation was over. Now it was time to formulate the plan. There would be no more warnings, no more second chances. The Bank of Alexandria was officially closed. With the damning evidence organized in a clear, undeniable spreadsheet, my path forward became obvious. This was no longer a family squabble to be mediated over a cup of tea. This was a significant financial malfeasance that required a formal, legally sound solution. My first call on the morning of December 27th wasn't to my mother, but to David Chen, my family's lawyer. David had been my father's friend and had helped draft the very trust I was now trying to protect. He was a quiet, meticulous man who shared my father's no-nonsense approach to life. I laid out the situation for him over the phone, my voice calm and professional, betraying none of the personal fury that still simmered beneath the surface. I explained the Christmas incident, Sophie's frantic phone call, and the subsequent deep dive into their finances. I emailed him the spreadsheet, the reckoning XLSX, while we were still on the line. I heard him let out a low whistle as he scrolled through the data. "Alexandra," he said, his voice grave. "This is worse than I thought. This isn't just poor money management. This is a clear and sustained abuse of your fiduciary duty to the trust. You're not just entitled to act, you are obligated to." His words were a powerful validation. He confirmed that as the executor, I had broad authority to change the terms of the disbursements, especially in light of such gross misconduct. We spent the next hour mapping out a strategy. It wouldn't be enough to simply cut them off. That would be chaotic and could potentially harm Lily, who was the innocent party in all of this. The goal wasn't to destroy them, but to force them into a reality they had been avoiding for a decade. The solution had to be surgical. It had to be absolute. Our plan had three key components. First, the immediate and permanent termination of their supplementary account and the associated credit card. From this moment on, they would not have direct access to a single penny of the trust's funds. All financial support would cease, with a few carefully controlled exceptions. Second, the trust would continue to make the primary mortgage payment on their house, but it would be paid directly to the bank. This was to protect the asset and ensure Lily had a roof over her head, but it came with a major condition. They would be required to provide me with a full accounting of their second mortgage and present a viable plan to pay it down using their own income. Failure to do so would result in the trust placing a lien on the property for the total amount they had misappropriated. The third component was the most critical. David and I agreed that any future support for Lily, for her education, healthcare, or genuine necessities, would be managed exclusively by me. I would set up a separate, protected sub-account within the trust, designated solely for her benefit. Nathan and Sophie would have no access to it. If Lily needed new shoes, Sophie would have to email me the receipt for reimbursement. If she needed to see a doctor, the bill would be sent directly to my office. This system would ensure the child was cared for, as my father intended, while completely removing her parents as the corrupt middlemen. Finally, we drafted a formal letter, a legal document that would be delivered to them in person. It would outline, in cold, hard legal terms, the immediate changes to their financial situation. It would state the total amount they had misappropriated from the trust, a figure I had calculated to be just over $247,000, and declare it a debt owed back to the trust. It would also stipulate that they were required to attend mandatory financial counseling with a certified credit counselor, at their own expense, if they ever hoped to see another form of support, even in a dire emergency. After finalizing the plan with David, my next and most difficult task was to talk to my mother. I drove to her house that afternoon, armed with a simplified version of my spreadsheet. I sat with her in her quiet living room, the same room where I had been humiliated just days before. I walked her through everything, gently but firmly. I showed her the vacation charges that were disguised as a new roof, the designer handbags logged as business expenses, the hidden second mortgage that put her granddaughter's home at risk. Tears streamed down her face as the reality of her son's deception set in. It was one thing to know he was irresponsible. It was another to see the cold, hard proof of his betrayal. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Why would he do this? We gave him everything." "Because we never let him fail," I said softly, taking her hand. "We always bailed him out. Dad's trust was meant to be a safety net, not a hammock. I'm not doing this to punish him, Mom. I'm doing this to save him from himself and to protect what Dad worked his whole life to build. I'm protecting Lily's future." To her immense credit, once the initial shock wore off, her resolve hardened. She was a teacher who had dealt with unruly children her whole life, and she recognized the pattern of an overgrown child who had never been taught the meaning of the word no. She looked at me, her eyes clear and fierce. "You're right, Alexandra," she said, her voice steady. "You are the executor. You do what you have to do." With my lawyer's legal backing and my mother's moral support, the plan was locked in. The financial cord, which had for so long been a lifeline they had twisted into a leash, was about to be severed for good. All that was left was the final confrontation. The confrontation was scheduled for New Year's Eve. I chose the date deliberately. It was a time for endings and new beginnings, a day to close one chapter and forcibly start another. I told Nathan and Sophie that we needed to have a family meeting at Mom's house to discuss the financial irregularities with the account. The formal, impersonal language was intentional, designed to let them know this wasn't a casual chat. They agreed to come, their tone a mixture of sullen and defiant. They clearly believed they could charm, bully, or guilt their way out of this, as they always had. They had no idea they were walking into a legal and financial ambush. I arrived early with 2 copies of the legal document David had prepared, neatly placed in manila envelopes. My mother was nervous, wringing her hands, but she gave me a determined nod when I walked in. We were a united front. When Nathan and Sophie arrived, the air was thick with tension. They left Lily in the car with a tablet, a clear sign they knew this would not be a pleasant conversation. They walked in without a greeting, their faces set in stone. Nathan spoke first, his voice laced with aggression. "All right, Alex, what is this all about? Sophie told me you lost your mind and cut off the card. You've had your little power trip. It's time to turn it back on." I didn't rise to the bait. I simply gestured to the dining room table. "Please, sit down," I said in a calm, measured voice. They exchanged a look of annoyance but complied, slumping into the chairs. My mother sat at the head of the table, and I sat opposite them. I slid the envelopes across the polished wood surface. "This is a formal notice from the Trust's legal counsel," I began, my voice steady. "I suggest you read it carefully." Nathan scoffed, pushing the envelope away. "I'm not reading anything, just fix the card, we have bills to pay." "Actually," I said, leaning forward, "you don't have the money to pay them. The Trust, however, does." Sophie's eyes narrowed. "What is that supposed to mean?" I opened my copy of the document and laid it flat on the table. "It means that over the past 5 years, you have defrauded our father's trust of approximately $247,000. The color drained from Nathan's face. Sophie let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. "That's ridiculous. That's a lie." "Is it?" I countered, my voice as cold as ice. I pulled out the summary page from my spreadsheet. "Is the all-inclusive trip to St. Lucia that you took with the roofing money a lie? Are the $3,000 handbags you claimed as business supplies, Sophie, a lie? Is the secret $100,000 second mortgage you took out on your house, putting Lily's home at risk while you used trust funds to make the payments, a lie?" I let the accusations hang in the air. The silence was absolute. Sophie stared at me, her mouth agape, for once in her life utterly speechless. Nathan's bravado completely evaporated, replaced by a pasty, terrified pallor. He looked like a cornered animal. How did you know about that?" he stammered. "It's my job to know," I replied flatly. "I am the executor. My responsibility is to the Trust, not to your extravagant lifestyle, and you have abused it for the last time." I then laid out the new terms, point by agonizing point: the immediate termination of their account, the direct payment of their primary mortgage, the requirement for them to handle the second mortgage and all other debts on their own, the new system for Lily's expenses requiring receipts and direct reimbursement, and finally, the declaration of the $247,000 as a formal debt owed back to the trust. Sophie finally found her voice, a high-pitched wail of despair. "You can't do this to us. We'll lose everything. My career, my followers, our house. You should have thought of that while you were lying and stealing from your own family," my mother interjected, her voice shaking with a quiet fury that was more intimidating than any shouting. "Your father would be ashamed of you, Nathan." That blow, coming from our mother, seemed to hit Nathan harder than anything I had said. He slumped in his chair, a broken man. The fight went out of them, replaced by a pathetic, desperate pleading. They begged, they promised to change. I promised to pay it all back if I would just turn the card back on for one more month. It was a pathetic, predictable display. "No," I said, my voice final. "The time for promises is over. This is not a negotiation. These are the new terms. They are legally binding. You can either accept them or David and I will proceed with legal action to recover the stolen funds, which will involve seizing your assets, including your cars and the house." The threat of total ruin was the final nail in the coffin. They were trapped. Their lies had built them a beautiful prison, and I had just locked the door and thrown away the key. They sat in stunned silence, the reality of their new life crashing down on them. No more fancy dinners. No more designer clothes. No more keeping up with the Joneses. Just a mountain of debt and the meager income from a car salesman and a fading influencer. They had laughed at my cheap junk. Now, they were about to learn the true cost of their expensive tastes. The lesson in consequences had been delivered. The aftermath was not a sudden, dramatic explosion, but a slow, painful implosion of the life Nathan and Sophie had so carefully constructed. The first few weeks of the new year were filled with a barrage of angry, then pleading, then venomous texts and voicemails sent to my mother as my number remained blocked. They tried to manipulate her, to paint me as a cruel, vindictive monster who had snatched the food from their mouths. But the evidence I had shown her was too stark, too undeniable. She stood firm, directing them back to the legal notice every single time. "Talk to Alexandra's lawyer" became her mantra. The most visible change was Sophie's social media presence. Her posts about new luxury acquisitions and lavish trips abruptly stopped. They were replaced by vague, inspirational quotes about overcoming challenges and finding beauty in simplicity. Her followers, accustomed to a steady diet of high-end consumerism, were not impressed. Her engagement plummeted. The carefully curated illusion of effortless wealth shattered, and with it, her career. It turned out that without a bottomless pit of money to fund her content, she had very little of value to offer. She was forced to get a part-time job as a receptionist at a dental office, a dose of reality that was, by all accounts, a bitter pill to swallow. Nathan, stripped of his ability to wine and dine clients on the trust's dime, found that his charm alone wasn't enough. His sales numbers, which had always been mediocre and propped up by an expensive image, collapsed. They were forced to sell the new luxury SUV, taking a huge loss. 6 months later, the "for sale" sign went up in front of their house. They couldn't keep up with the payments on the second mortgage and their other consumer debt without the trust's illegal subsidy. They downsized to a small, cramped rental apartment across town. The shame was palpable. They stopped coming to extended family gatherings, unable to face the quiet judgment and whispered conversations. My relationship with my brother and his wife was, for all intents and purposes, over. There was too much damage, too much betrayal to ever go back. But my relationship with my niece, Lily, entered a new and surprisingly wonderful phase. Under the new system, Sophie was forced to communicate with me about Lily's needs. The emails were clipped and cold, but I made sure every legitimate request was met instantly. I paid for her art classes directly to the studio. I reimbursed Sophie for new school clothes within an hour of receiving the receipts. When Lily needed braces, I coordinated directly with the orthodontist to set up a payment plan from the trust. Through this, Lily and I started to build a bond. When I dropped off a check at her art studio one afternoon, I stayed to watch her class. Her face lit up when she saw me. She proudly showed me her watercolor of a sunset, her technique already showing remarkable improvement. We started having monthly Aunt Alex and Lily days. I would take her to museums, to the park for a picnic, or to the library. During these outings, she was a different child, curious, bright, and free from the materialistic pressures of her home life. One day, she apologized to me out of the blue. "I'm sorry I said your Christmas present was junk," she said, her lower lip trembling. "Mommy and Daddy were just mad because your gift for Grandma was better than theirs." I hugged her tightly. "It's okay, sweetie. You don't ever have to be sorry for telling the truth." My life became quieter, and in that quiet, I found a profound sense of peace. My finances, already stable, flourished now that I wasn't constantly plugging the leaks in my brother's sinking ship. I set up a robust investment plan for my mother, ensuring her final years would be comfortable and completely secure. I started traveling more, not to flashy resorts, but to places I had always wanted to see, the ancient ruins in Greece, the serene temples of Japan. I was living my life for myself, on my own terms. The revenge I got wasn't loud or explosive. It was the quiet, satisfying hum of a life put back in order. It was seeing Lily thrive, her creativity nurtured by the very funds her parents had tried to squander. It was the peace of mind that came with knowing my father's legacy was secure, used for its intended purpose, to provide genuine care, not to fuel a fantasy. Family, I learned, isn't just about blood or obligation. It's about respect, honesty, and mutual support. I had lost a brother, but I had saved my family's legacy and gained a real, meaningful connection with my niece. I had redrawn the boundaries, and in doing so, I had created a new, smaller, but infinitely stronger and more honest definition of family. And that was a treasure more valuable than anything Nathan and Sophie could ever buy.